what I'm going to do, I've got about 15 minutes. All I thought I would do is give you, everybody, a little bit of background to the book that we edited, and why we thought it was important to do it, and then perhaps a taste of what's in it. And as many of you be aware, about 20 years ago, Taya and I, with a group of concerned scholars, including some in the present volume, including some in the present audience, came together in a workshop in Wageningen to discuss the utility of vulnerability as both a conceptual and methodological tool. And that workshop led to the publication of Mapping Vulnerability, Disaster Development and People in 2004. But many things have changed really since that book came out, both in the world and about how we think about it, and about what makes people vulnerable. And while we very much acknowledge that resilience and adaptation are welcome additions in our understanding of disaster risk reduction, but they also serve and have been used as such, sometimes to mask social inequalities or absolve state from their duty of care, and perhaps even blame disasters on nature once again and return us to an all too familiar hazard-focused trope. We maintain that vulnerability places the stress where it rightly should be, on the processes that put people at risk in the first place, and we considered it was time to rethink what vulnerability means and perhaps how we apply it. Hence the second workshop, this time in Den Haag. Seems to be that we're following you around here, Taya. And the second volume titled Why Vulnerability Still Matters. And in this volume, it includes some of the original contributors in the earlier volume to see how their ideas changed, but also many fresh voices that may see vulnerability from different perspectives. So what's changed in the last 20 years since the other volume came out? Well, first of all, of course, is the dominance of new theoretical and methodological frameworks, particularly resilience and adaptation. Resilience, with the end of the Cold War in 1991, there's been an increasing emphasis on how societies and peoples should be seen no longer as simply vulnerable, but as resilient with capacities to adjust, organize, learn, change, etc. And adaptation with the need for human societies to adjust to new conditions, perhaps even to transform societies as well. And the key concept that is coming out there, which we're all very familiar with, is climate change adaptation. Mm-hmm. And several authors in this book discuss these and related developments. The chapters from Terry Cannon, Taya Dickinson, and Ian Burton, and myself in particular, stress these kinds of changes. The second group of changes is about climate change. This was certainly there 20 years ago, but it was still, I would say, a muted rumble 20 years ago. But now it's a very real and pressing concern. There's overwhelming scientific evidence that supports the conclusion that human activity is changing climate. But the current debate is more about whether climate change is going to be gradual, allowing societies time enough to adjust, or whether it's going to be non-linear, whereby crossing some kind of threshold will precipitate catastrophic change. Little can be done in the latter case apart from trying to ensure that we don't reach that tipping point. But if it's gradual, then that will allow societies to adapt. And many authors in the volume also engage with this debate. Cassia Mika and Ilan Kelman, Bjorn Sivers and Karen O'Brien, amongst others. And thirdly, a change about war, conflict, and humanitarianism. It's a clunky title, but it's summing up a whole class of changes that I think are very important. There was a remarkable omission in early disaster studies with a lack of attention to the impact of conflict, despite a very strong statistical relationship between conflict and disasters, and the many ways in which conflict negatively affects hazards. And many of the authors in this volume deal with this issue. Ayesha Siddiqi's chapter, Taya's own chapter, Suzanne Jasper's chapter, and Louis Artaud's, among many others, touch on these matters. And then a fourth change is about precarity, a new class in the making that has emerged out of neoliberalism of the last 30 years, which has been entitled the precariat. These include the under or unemployed educated youth, a growing number of the criminalized, the disabled, and of course, in particular, migrants very much constitute this group. Now, this group has long been in the making in lower and middle income countries, but I think it's the growth of the precariat in high income countries that, especially since the banking crisis of 2007, that is something that is very, very noticeable. And then this leads to the idea of disaster risk creation. Perhaps a final change is the term vulnerability gradually has lost its critical potential. A new term has arisen to partly fill the gap, and that's disaster risk creation. Disaster risk creation re-emphasizes the causes of disaster risk and recognizes that they are created through human interference with natural hazards. It re-emphasizes social production of vulnerability and the neglect of response capacities, or it is a combination of all three. And nearly all the authors in this volume make this connection either implicitly or explicitly. And I thought that I would just end this short introduction by reading the last two paragraphs of the introduction to our volume. In mapping vulnerability, we asked what makes people vulnerable, and then proceeded to describe that landscape of vulnerability, showing that while there were possible paths on this map, there were no set routes or even fixed destinations. 2 decades later, we find ourselves asking whether vulnerability still matters, when, if anything, the terrain is even more complex now than it was then, and we are even more in need of a compass to guide us in the right direction, to ask the hard questions. What's more, it seems that we have decided to abandon a trusted set of coordinates for newer ones. Resilience and adaptation create a somewhat different topography of risk. We maintain, however, that vulnerability still matters very much. The poor, the destitute, the disadvantaged, the displaced, the disabled, the un- or underemployed, and the homeless have not disappeared. If anything, the root causes of such conditions are more acute today than they were 50 or even 20 years ago. The nature of vulnerability too has changed, is changing, as the authors in this volume make clear. There is a new political order that is more threatening than the structured certainties of the Cold War past, in which environment-fueled conflicts or post-conflict situations are considered the norm. There is a new social order, also premised on uncertainties, in which precarity in life opportunities, both personal and professional, is becoming the dominant condition. And then there is climate change, the biggest uncertainty of all, where fluctuations in average temperatures and rainfall mean more floods, more droughts, higher seas, worse storms, and much more suffering. While the emphasis over the last 20 years has been on disaster risk reduction, the outcome has often been disaster risk creation. Yes, we need to be resilient, and yes, we need to adapt. But more than anything else, we need to recognize what makes us vulnerable and address the issues that put us all at risk, and some more so than others. And I'll leave it there.
Yes, so let me start by kind of apologizing. I have a really bad hay fever, and so you're going to possibly hear me blow my nose and do things I would prefer not to, but unfortunately find myself in this situation. I really just have a few slides together and want to talk about the chapter that I wrote for this edited volume. And it was, I mean, let me kind of start by also saying thank you to Thea and Greg for inviting me to be part of this really incredible edited book, because it gave me a chance to kind of put on paper ideas that I had been thinking about and questions that I'd been asking. So what I've tried to do in this chapter is really talk about two things, or bring together kind of two ideas that were in my mind when we first met in The Hague and at the workshop to talk about our ideas and our chapters. Next slide, please. What I was thinking about at that time was that in a lot of my work, what I try and I do is I really tease out the state-citizen relationship and how disasters kind of impact, and what are the kinds of ways in which the disaster is lived by citizens. What are the kinds of things they're expecting of the state? How is it that the state responds? And particularly in the context of the post-colonial world, with a particularly kind of unique history and a unique set of circumstances driving those kinds of relationships, I really try and challenge kind of Western ideas of what, for example, a social contract between a state and a citizen should look like, because it means different things to different people at different times in different parts of the world. And then on top of that, while those ideas are always in my head and are the focus of a considerable amount of work that I've done in the past, I was now also really thinking about what could a post-colonial critique to disaster studies look like. So if we really think of the way that the big post-colonial theorists have thought about critiquing mainstream ideas, what would that kind of critique look like, and how would they do it? And I kind of came back to this idea that actually what we really need to do is question the role of dominant forces such as the state, or maybe particularly the state, in not just creating the vulnerability, but also the very hazards, the very hazard that drive disasters in the post-colonial world. And I do this picking out or teasing out particular nuances in case studies and research that I've done in two particular contexts. And I'll just get to talking about those two empirical cases in a moment. Next slide, please. Before I do that, the empirical data that I present in this chapter is from Philippines and Colombia. And in both of these instances, I'm looking at particular disasters that occurred in the midst of armed conflict, or in Colombia, it was a kind of post-accord or post-signing of a peace accord with the rebels, but still different forms of insecurity around narco traffickers. And so there, as is often the case, people are not just reckoning with too many rains or too little rains. There is a whole slew of other issues, other challenges, other vulnerabilities that they're dealing with, including being in the midst of often particularly kind of insecure circumstances. And that's what my two kind of cases are focused on. Next slide, please. And what I think that I try and do in this chapter, though I don't know if I'm always successful, is present this idea that in this very kind of complex and compound situation of disasters in post-colonial context, it's often quite hard to draw a kind of clear distinction between this is where the physical hazard starts and this is where the social vulnerability starts. Because actually that division between what is physical and what is a part of the social system is quite blurry and quite kind of political even. And I suggest that what we need to do is look at this within that kind of historical process from within which the hazard emerges. Next slide, please. So as an, sorry, one before this, recognizing that there is a particular kind of hazard, politics of hazard creation, which really allows us to address these particular critiques within or that have emerged around disaster studies, which is one that we really need to get much better at representing the voice of the subaltern, the post-colonial subject, the person who's really at the front lines facing these disasters. And secondly, that we need to kind of move away from that inevitability of the physical and the natural hazard. So in a way, what this chapter is trying to do is to some extent kind of address both of those critiques. Next slide, please. And what I do, and I'm not going to kind of bore anyone with the details of how I flesh it out. It's there in the paper, but really I demonstrate that in the case of a particular kind of landslide, very much part of a compound hazard, the mixing of a lot of heavy rains with movement of silting, etc. That whole hazard itself was the product of particular forms of marginalization and movement of particularly politically disempowered people and indigenous group in Mindanao, the Mandaya, to an area which made that area much more kind of susceptible and hazardous to this particular kind of landslide. So the physical hazard itself was very much the product of the state imposing a particular kind of marginalization and continuing a particular kind of exclusion of this community in this part of the country. And next slide, please. And in Colombia, the evidence that I saw was quite similar, where not just the vulnerability, but again, the hazard itself, the particular kind of flooding that people were subjected to was part of the way that the state ensured that they were able to manage and control particular kinds of poor and indigenous populations. And so I think what I want to kind of get at with this chapter, and it's part of work that I'm developing further. So this chapter very much kind of contributing to the way that I'm thinking about the subaltern, the post-colonial subject within disaster studies, what their role is, how they fit in. That whole discussion kind of begins a little bit in my own thinking, begins with the end of this chapter, and I'm trying to take this work further. Next slide, please. And what I want to kind of say is that disasters are this kind of continuation of state violence through other means at the margins of the post-colony. And next slide, please. The last kind of bit that I have on this is really to draw attention to the fact that creating hazards and risks are in fact active tools of governmentality to manage subaltern populations enables a particular kind of deconstruction of the politics of hazard creation. And in doing this, it provides the tools and the language with which to address some of the shortcomings within contemporary disaster studies, because citizens on the margins of the state experience the coming together of familiar processes of exclusion, of denial of rights, of disempowerment in these floods and landslides. And subaltern voices in Philippines and Colombia discursively construct hazards as a political choice, illustrating that they themselves are dispensable to the post-colonial state, and that continues their long-standing marginalization through these or by these dominant forces. And for disaster studies to really reconcile with the post-colonial, the subaltern subjects who are at the margins of the state, it must open itself to ontologies that see hazard creation themselves as less physical and as more part of a longer history of oppression within the post-colonial state. And hopefully, I'm going to develop some new work from this. But this is where I leave the chapter. Thank you.